World Art and Culture, Lesson 4, Part 2. In Part 1, we looked at the earliest Greek cultures and civilizations from the Aegean, the so-called ancient Aegean, the Cycladic civilization, the Minoan civilization in Crete, and then finally the first mainland civilization at the city of Mycenae. Now we will proceed to discuss the post-Dark Age world of Greece after the disaster or otherwise catastrophe of around 1200 BC. Greek civilization reemerges, beginning somewhere around the 8th, maybe 9th century BC, and it will develop, of course, now into eventually what we have come to know as classical Greek culture. This will begin on the mainland and perhaps centered on the city of Athens, where most of the great Greek accomplishments politically, culturally, will develop. Athens will become the center of Greek culture until the time of Alexander the Great. Now let's review a little bit about, review and expand upon Greek religion. Greek religion, as we said, is unique because of its communal aspect. Um, um, it's a religion that centers on rites of the sacrifice, sacrificial rites, sacrificial rituals. It included children and women in its activities. It was also quite a aesthetically centered religious system, meaning that the rituals themselves, and as we'll see, other aspects of Greek life, were connected to Greek notions of beauty and of general aesthetic considerations. The sacrifice was the most important rite. It included sacred pourings or libations, votive offerings, vows that were made. Like all cultures that deal in sacrifice, sacrifice for the Greeks was a kind of reciprocal gift that necessitated both a gift, a sacrifice, some kind of sacrificial offering in return for something. The Greeks often sacrificed in a way of giving thanks, but also reciprocally as a way of asking for good events, good weather, good fortune in war, etc. Greek religion also is unique because of its pantheon, its gods. The Greeks conceived their gods as anthropomorphic, and this is unique and pretty much unprecedented that we have a religious system where the gods themselves are now fully human, at least in their physical appearance. These are not hybrid gods. Some of the gods have powers and can change themselves into animals and communicate with humans in dreams, etc., and travel in supernatural ways, but they are fully human in their physical and perhaps even intellectual dimensions. The Greek gods are also beautiful, and very important to realize the aesthetic quality of the Greek gods. They are beautiful, and in many ways they are as as uh, as flawed though as human beings. They have the same passions and negative aspects as human beings. They are petty. They are jealous. They are incestuous. They are adulterous. They lie. They cheat. One of the reasons why the philosopher Plato condemned the gods of Homeric myth and of the gods of Hesiod, who wrote about the gods before Homer, was their lack of moral perfection, their actual flaunting of their moral imperfections. As we look at one of the Greek gods here, Zeus. Again, the gods are anthropomorphic. They reflect, on the other hand, they reflect human flaws. The difference between gods and humans, of course, is that they are immortal, and humans have a finite life. Again, let's not forget this relates to the Greek notion that life itself is limited and that life itself is the most important part of human existence, again in contrast to the Egyptians who saw time in their temporal dimension as infinite. The Greeks do see the world as finite for the human being, and the difference between the divine, the gods, and the humans has to do with mortality and immortality. The great sin or the great abomination of human beings, particularly in relation to gods, hubris, is a kind of arrogance to compare yourself to gods, particularly in terms of immortality. There are many stories in Greek myth about the challenges that humans make towards the gods, and they often end up horribly punished as well as defeated. This is Zeus's wife Hera. Zeus is perhaps the most notorious of the sexually promiscuous of the gods. Hera, his wife, often is depicted as perhaps the goddess of wives and of their inability to keep their husbands chaste. Now, another thing to remember about Greek religion that perhaps has bearing on much of Greek thought is, again, it's communal, which reflects this communal idea of Greek society itself. And we mentioned earlier that the Greeks will eventually invent democracy, or the rule by the people, by the many. Before this, Greece was probably, even before the Dark Ages, was perhaps ruled by some kind of aristocratic element. Aristocracy itself in Greek means rules by or of the best, and this would be something that Plato later will emphasize as his ideal system: aristocracy, the rule by the best, or the wisest. Democracy, on the other hand, is the rule technically by the citizens. Now, there are some theories about how this came about. Perhaps democracy will sort of create itself in Greece by about the middle of the 8th century. That's what the sources tell us. The city-state itself, the so-called polis, develops at the same time. There's a theory that because of the trauma of the Dark Ages, that the Greeks sort of bonded together, and out of this kind of egalitarian formation, coming from the trauma of the Dark Ages, came this democratic idea, this idea of community, of identity through partnership, this sharing of government, self-consciousness of political identity, legal equality. This is also connected, perhaps, as we look at the god Hermes here. This is probably also connected to the Greek notion of discourse, or the so-called dialectic, the idea of discussion and deliberation, again by many towards some kind of agreement. The idea of discussion or deliberation, dialogue, dialectic, as Plato called it, is key to understanding not just the Greek democratic system, but the whole Greek identity and the Greek way of thinking, that knowledge is not something that is simple or simplistic. It certainly doesn't come about by simply accepting one notion of truth, but is something that needs to be deliberated upon, thought about, and as we'll see, truth and knowledge isn't kind of an everlasting quest. It's not finite, and or teleological, as we might call it. It's a much more of a path or a journey. Now, this let's call it egalitarianism, democracy, partnership, community. All these notions that seem to pervade all of the Greek institutions will, of course, inform and have an effect upon what will become key questions and unprecedented questions that the Greeks are going to ask these are questions that were pretty much taken, well, these are issues that were pretty much taken for granted. They were never questioned by the people of Mesopotamia, by the Egyptians even. But the Greeks are the first sort of inquiring people who never took anything for granted, never just simply accepted the given. This could be connected to what we just mentioned, this sense of knowledge being something that has to be deliberated and discussed. Nonetheless, the Greeks are going to ask questions that are unique and unprecedented. Most of them begin with sort of abstract notions that, again, the earlier civilizations simply took for granted. What is truth itself, for example? That was one of the questions. What is truth? From this comes the idea of logic or logos. What is happiness? How do you live the right life? How do you procure happiness? This, of course, is going to lead into the development of the idea of ethics. What is beauty? Beauty really was not discussed in any way like the Greeks will discuss it until the Greeks. Beauty was really not a category of thought. There was craftsmanship, there was value, as we saw, but beauty as an aesthetic dimension of human creativity, and as we'll see, as a divine manifestation of supernatural form, is something the Greeks will invent. Aesthetics will be the study of beauty. History pretty much will be invented by the Greeks. Myth, of course, predates history. The word mythos in Greek literally means a retelling of something, but history is, as Herodotus and Thucydides, the first Greek historians, defined it, as more of a more or less accurate, and certainly a educational retelling of events of the past, mostly to learn from the past. The idea that you learn from history comes from the Greeks, the idea that those who do not study history are bound to repeat it, and of course history is mostly focused towards teaching, instructing the events of the past and the decisions that people made in the past, leaders and so forth. And in that way, the didactic dimension of history is very important. It teaches you. What is love? Another unprecedented question. What is sexuality? The Greeks will make a distinction between love and sexuality, perhaps. They will certainly see sexuality and love as not necessarily synthetic and wholly similar concepts, as we will see. What is justice? Another question the Greeks will ask, connected to what is happiness, what is the good life, what is goodness, ethics. The Greeks will invent drama. Theater itself will be an invention of the Greeks, perhaps something that derived from primordial times in the aspects of ritual. According to Greek mythology, the inventor of drama and the theater itself was Dionysus, the god of wine, the god of sexuality, the god of passion and excess. We'll talk about drama as an important part of Greek life in a minute. To return to the Greek gods, as we look at some other deities here, this is Aphrodite, the goddess of love. Love for the Greeks, as we just mentioned, is not necessarily the same as sexuality. Love, or philos, as the Greeks called it, is more of a familial term, between the love between parents and their children, between mother and father, the love for brothers, sisters, for friends, for your country, the love of institutions, this kind of the love of people for each other, brotherhood of man, we might call it now. That is different, of course, from eros, which is more sexual love or passionate love or erotic love, which can but is not necessarily related to philos. Sexual love, erotic love, is of course connected to to the more passionate side of human nature, the so-called Dionysian. And perhaps we'll talk about this great division within the human mind as we discuss another great unprecedented question the Greeks will ask: simply, what is humanity? They will invent the study of human beings. Humanitatis, as the Greek, Latin classical writers will later call it, the study of humanity, the humanities. The study of the human condition is another Greek invention, and it leads to a discovery by the Greeks, which is often forgotten, which is that the human condition is basically dichotomous, or split in two. We have a rational side, which the Greeks identified with the god Apollo, who we see here, the god of rationality, the god of light, god of truth in many ways, the kind of a god of civilization, of order. The Greeks identified this so-called Apollonian side of human nature with Apollo and with rationality, with perhaps the idea of logos, and maybe ethics, the right way of living. But there was another side to human nature. Again, the Greeks saw almost everything in dichotomies, in divisions and opposites, and human nature also has an opposite side, outside, next to, along with its rational side, its irrational or so-called Dionysian side, which of course is named after the god Dionysus, the god of wine, the god of excess, orgiastic, violence, sexuality. What's important to realize is that the Greeks understood that we have this Dionysian side of our human nature, our human psyche, our human soul, but that this is not necessarily something, well, it's necessary not to reject this or to obscure it. It needs to be understood, embraced, at times celebrated, even though that might sound dangerous, but it has to be balanced. And this gets us to perhaps the key notion in Greek thought, which is proportion. It needs to be balanced. Our human nature has a rational side, the Apollonian side, and an irrational side, the Dionysian side. These two poles have to be balanced, like everything else in life, through proportion, through harmony. One does not negate the other, they have to be balanced. And as we'll see, proportion, or symmetria as the Greeks called it, is a key principle not just in human nature, let's say in human ethics, human morality, but it's a key notion in aesthetics and in politics. The notion of balance and symmetry is in a way embedded in the democratic ideal. And of course it's going to be an issue that religion will deal with and address. The Dionysian side, as we see some of Dionysus's entourage here, the Maenads, who were sort of priestesses or goddesses of Dionysus, or in some ways you could call them groupies of Dionysus, who involved themselves in ecstatic and intoxicating dances. The Dionysian side, again, is something that is part of human nature. It can't be denied, it can't be suppressed, it has to be balanced, just like everything else in life. Sound mind, sound body. The Apollonian and the Dionysian have to be balanced and proportionally adhered to. Now, Dionysus is very important because, as we said, he also is claimed as the inventor of drama. Now, Greek drama, Greek theater, according to the myth or the legend, was invented by Dionysus as a ritual, perhaps a sacred circle. Many of the words that are still around in theater, like orchestra, chorus, the word tragedy itself, which literally means goat song, have to do with, etymologically speaking, have to do with Dionysian rites. And it's believed the first sort of theatrical structure or drama was perhaps a sacred rite, which was done inside of a circle, which included music and song, of course, drinking, intoxication. Those who were initiated would be inside the circle, while those spectators would be outside the circle. watching. The actors would, of course, be inside, and the spectators, those who viewed, on the outside. And this is kind of the template for theater, based on religious ritual, Dionysian perhaps. The the actors eventually, those who initiated and performed the rituals would eventually become, of course, actors. The word drama itself is connected to this. Drama and drama is a kind of a sacred act or deed. It comes from the verb to do. And then theater itself means literally a place of seeing or a place of viewing. The Greeks divided their theater into comedy and tragedy. Tragedy being a kind of display of the human condition and on all its paradoxes and tragedies, as we of course define the word today. Whereas comedy was considered a very serious but obviously more satirical art. Often comedies made fun of or satirized society, the gods, civilization itself. Drama, then, theater, like everything else, we must remember, has a religious function. There really isn't anything that the Greeks do that isn't connected to religion, to their religion. As we look at the Parthenon here in Athens, religion is part of Greek athletics. The Olympic Games that were established in the 8th century were and continue to be throughout the Greek world a mostly religious ritual, part of religious festivals. The competition itself was connected to religious festivals. Drama and theater were part of religious festivals. Almost everything the Greeks do, we could say, is religious. But this is the main point here that we want to get at, is that the Greeks did not see religion or their endeavors at asking questions as simply finite ways of finding truth. In other words, the Greeks did not really see the human condition as enabling or producing clear answers. Life is very complex, and as Socrates says, the only thing we know for sure is that we know nothing. And these questions are good enough just simply to ask. It's the idea of knowledge for its own sake. Philosophy, the love of wisdom, the love of knowledge, something else the Greeks invented, is not necessarily, we can't get that confused with scientific knowledge, which does have a kind of a teleological endpoint. Truth, knowledge, justice, all of these questions the Greeks pondered really did not necessitate an answer, at least not maybe perhaps a perfect answer. Again, they necessitated deliberation, discussion, discourse, towards perhaps not necessarily a perfect answer or a complete answer, but some kind of understanding. And the idea that questions are in themselves important to ask, and the quest of the question is what's important, is something the Greeks, again, seem to have invented. Remember, before the Greeks, people simply took things for granted. The truth was what the king had procured from the gods. Justice was what was written in the laws. Love was marriage. The Greeks, though, will ask questions in a manner that does not take the answer for granted, and certainly embraces this idea of deliberation. Now, all of this democracy, the makeup of the city-state, this sort of notion of questioning without a finite answer, the deliberation and discourse that the Greeks embrace throughout their lives, might be perhaps the birth of the notion of individual worth or individualism. Certainly this idea is something that we modern Western people seem to connect to ancient Greece. This idea that the individual counts, that individual thought, individual reason, individual logos individual dignity is valued, perhaps now for the first time in history, by the Greeks. If we believe this and we hold on to the usual narrative, this individualism will in many ways be perhaps usurped or taken aback at the end of the classical world in the Middle Ages, to be reborn, perhaps in Florence during the Renaissance. But we'll discuss that possibility later. Now, the Greeks, of course, are inventors of the notion of beauty, as we just said, or aesthetics. And aesthetics, which comes from the word to perceive in Greek, aesthesis, was, of course, connected to vision and to the optical apprehension of the world. The Greeks, we could say, are the first naturalists, the first people that looked at the world directly, did not see it as a obscure thing, and then went about to represent that world in images, through linguistic representation, in history, in the narratives of history, and in another Greek invention, literature, poetry, epic poetry, lyric poetry, and of course drama. This notion is, the Greeks knew it, is mimesis, which just means imitation, the representation of life, either visual representation through images, architectural representation, and of course linguistic representation. The Greeks, perhaps because of their focus on life, wanted to record that life and make it memorable. As we saw, this was something that went back to the first civilizations. Architecture itself played a huge role in Greek life. Most of the architecture, like everything else in Greece that was of value, was religious. The temple was the main center for the Greeks. The temple where the tenemos, where the god would live or appear, was the central focus of religious life. It's where the Greeks did their religious sacrifices and their rites. Their sacred rituals usually were preceded by a procession of the community to the spot of the temple where the sacrifices, libations, votives, etc. would be performed, again in a communal way. Greek architecture, of course, was connected to Greek aesthetics, and it was supposed to be, again, beautiful. And to understand the notion of beauty for the Greeks, we have to understand where it came from. And it came from Pythagoras, from the pre-Socratic philosopher and religious figure who in many ways we could say invented or discovered the idea of music. The idea of music meaning harmony, proportion, symmetry, rational intervals of notes and sounds. Pythagoras apparently invented or discovered the relationship between numbers, ratios, and music. This, of course, for him was not simply a artistic discovery, but he went on to create a whole school of thought whose motto was basically that all was number, all was based on number. Mathematics derives from this. The Greeks didn't invent mathematics, but they certainly gave it this dimension of aesthetic as well as cosmological significance. The Greeks, through Pythagoras, through Plato later on, believed that the universe itself was literally musical. It was created by God in a kind of design of harmony and concord and rhythm and proportion. This was numerical, deeply numerical in the end, and therefore the proportions and dimensions, ratios, harmonies, numerical proportions and harmonies